Welcome to my session about Salesforce Trainers, the Forgotten Specialists. So what can you expect in this session? Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about my journey to become a Salesforce trainer. I will then talk about the difference between a Salesforce certified trainer and an end user trainer. I'll talk about the knowledge you need as a trainer as well as a skill set. And I will close off with what a Salesforce training project could look like. But let me introduce myself first. So my name is Connie Hazendonk, originally from the Netherlands, where I also completed my university degree, and I started my career in market research. I worked for several of the big international market research companies, working for customers all over the world, helping them understand how their products are doing, either locally or on international markets, and trying to help them plan their strategic plans in seeing where they could gain more market share. As part of that, in 2003, I decided to move to the UK and stayed there for several more years as a market researcher. For me, it was about time to start looking for a new job. And one of the jobs that came around was introduced as, well, there's this company, they're still interested in doing like market analytics and market insights, but they're also looking somebody who's a bit tech advanced and is curious about new tech. And they're introducing something they called Salesforce. And so I decided to go for it, and that is how I became an accidental admin. My very first day there on the job was actually listening for 8 hours to an American developer talking about all the setup you can do in Salesforce. Having never seen it before, you can imagine my mind was blown. In 2014, that company downsized, and it gave me the opportunity to look for a different job. And I decided to become an independent consultant focusing on Salesforce training. Ever since then, I've been doing a lot of end-user trainer, which will be the main focus of this session. And I've also in 2019 become a certified Salesforce trainer, whereby I'm now allowed to give training on the administrator platform, so for certification for admin, as well as on the Service Cloud area. I'm still trying to get more of those certifications under my belt. Now, where have I trained? Pretty much all over the world. The continent that I am missing is South America. So if anybody has a nice project there, please do let me know. But as you can see, I've pretty much been all over the place with the main focus, different European countries. I've worked in around 16 different projects for a variety of clients. And some of those areas I'll touch upon a little bit later in the training. Now, thanks to COVID, of course, my home is now my office, and a lot of these sessions are now done through the internet, but it still allows me to work all over the world. And so my working days often start with early in the morning to cover Australia, during the day cover Europe, and then late in the evening cover America. Not the ideal situation, but at the end, it makes it possible now with everything online and that we can actually be more flexible in what we do. Now let's talk a little bit about the difference between a certified trainer and an end user trainer, because there are some differences. First of all, as a certified trainer, it means you are allowed to deliver the Salesforce certification course. So for example, if you sign up for one of those admin or developer courses or the consultancy courses, you get an official certified trainer. And I'm now one of those in the pool that are allowed to do that. It's not something you can just step into. So it's not something you can knock on Salesforce door and says, I want to become a Salesforce trainer. You actually have to work through a training partner. And there's quite a tough certification program on the back of it. It's more than just passing your product certification, which of course you need to know as base knowledge. But it's also really knowing the ins and outs of the platform, as well as they're looking at your delivery skills and at your classroom skills. So definitely if you're interested in it, I would say look on the Trailhead site and look for training partners and try to have a conversation with them, because that is how you can become involved in delivering training for people who want to become certified. For an end user trainer, the focus there is delivering training for the users. You can either do that directly or through training partners or consultancies. There's all kinds of different structures that are in place. One of the things is you don't really need a certification for that, and there is no certification for it. But having them is really a benefit of the way you work, because it really makes you that sort of rounded, knowledgeable person that really understands the platform and therefore can bring extra knowledge to the customer. Now, what kind of knowledge do we then need? And I think in my head, there's sort of two things that you need as a trainer. It's first of all, cloud knowledge, and second of all, industry or client knowledge. Now, let's talk a little bit about cloud knowledge first. I really think that as a trainer, if you have some solid admin knowledge, that is really beneficial. So that's just about getting not just a certification, but really having also some experience as an admin. A lot of training that you do is for end users. And so knowing how you can help in overcoming problems during training, for example, login issues, setup issues, maybe things not working, getting error messages, knowing where they're coming from and therefore knowing good potential fix or workaround is really beneficial. It really makes sure your training runs more smoothly. As for which clouds, it depends a little bit on the training projects. The majority of training projects are on the Sales Cloud, but more and more training projects are also coming into the areas of Service Cloud, Field Service, Lightning, and Marketing. So having those in addition to the sort of base knowledge will just help you and get a more variety of projects. Also a very broad knowledge of Salesforce. So with that, I mean, it's not just setup, but also, you know, what can you advise for a customer? Say then doing things in a certain way. Are there areas where you can help them make their life easier, guiding them to the right areas, giving them advice, or maybe, you know, maybe you should do maybe a little bit of validation here, or maybe you should implement some processes here. And knowing how to bridge that between the cloud and industry knowledge, again, it really helps in making the training run smoothly and being able to advise the customer on what they need. What I found over the years is actually if you have multiple cloud experience, it makes it more likely you stay with the customer for longer. A lot of customers start, for example, with a smaller project, say on the Sales Cloud, and they might then grow over time. And if you've done a good job to begin with, they will come back to you and say, hey, we know you did Sales Cloud a while ago. We're now progressing maybe in the email area of Marketing Cloud. Do you mind to come over and do another training project for us? Or they start with Service Cloud, and then maybe they say we go into Field Service. And again, you know, those areas are all linking together. And thereby having the knowledge of different areas, just it makes your life at the project longer and you build a lasting experience with your customers. Just guarantees you that you get more return of projects coming back to you. In relation to industry and client knowledge, it's sort of a tricky one, but I think what I found is, you know, I worked with an enormous amount of different customers over the years on all kinds of areas. The majority of customers, you know, I can't name them as client confidentiality, but if I would name them, you wouldn't even know they existed. For the majority of them, I haven't heard about them before I started the project, and I didn't even know what they did, of course. And that goes in things like, you know, utilities and recruitment that can sort of make sense. But areas like vehicle inspections, you know, building materials, chemical and food ingredients. There's all kinds of weird and wonderful customers out there that do some very interesting jobs. And over the years, I really gained a lot of knowledge about all these different areas. And that helps in when you do training and when you're advising an end user to be able to transfer that knowledge. Yes, they're different companies, but I found there are quite some similarities between them. I think if you first of all talk about the differences between them, the difference is actually mainly driven in two areas. It's industry complexity and the size of the project. And so with industry complexity, I mean, like maybe government is controlled by all kinds of laws and regulations, often a bit more slow moving because you talk about public budgets. And so, you know, it's not as easy to say, can we have please an extension here, or I need more time. But if you, for example, talk about the building manufacturer, you know, they talk about long-term projects, which are tens of years, because, you know, that's the time it takes to build an airport or a new runway or a new bit of the motorway. So with them, you can't talk about, oh, my opportunity. Yeah, it's a life cycle of a couple of weeks. You really talk about things far in the future, which has big implications also when you talk about any of your reporting areas. The other one is the size of project. So you can't really say a big company gives you a big project, but the scope is there. And I found that is often more the difference that is driving the different training projects, is the investment a company wants to do and how far they want to roll out Salesforce. A lot of them start small, and once it kicks off, they will become bigger and bigger. And if you're then in a big international company, again, the size of return in customers is just going to be bigger. Where you find a lot of similarities is I find, they're all very keen to introduce world-class tech. That's why they go to Salesforce. It's not uncommon to find in some of these companies, very old tech. The current project I'm working on, they have a 20-year-old system. And if you look at it, it is really interesting to see, let me say it like that. And of course, you start to run into problems that things don't work anymore. You can't do upgrades anymore. And it then makes sense to go to Salesforce. It's a fantastic new tool for them. But it brings with, of course, a lot of change. So that's on the back of it. But overall, the companies really want to say, okay, let's bring this new product into our area. As similarities, you find actually that the core processes are very similar. It doesn't matter what you sell as a principle. When you start selling, what you need in your system is an account, you need a contact, and you need an opportunity. You may use quotes and you may use contracts, but the core principle of all of them is the same. So again, when you do training, you can really hound in on that knowledge that you have from all kinds of different areas. And also explain to customers that, they're not alone in what they're doing. The amount of time I hear from customers like, oh, it's so difficult for us or from end users and we don't really understand it. And you can say, well, you're not alone in this. There are hundreds of other companies who are going through similar transitions, and they have, similar problems. And, without going into details of what those problems are, you can use your knowledge and the baggage that you have gained in actually explain to the customers like, yes, it's complicated for you and there's tricky areas, but I can help you, guide you through this because I understand where you're coming from and I can give you tips on how to make your life easier. Overall, I found with all the customers that do go into Salesforce and do these projects, they all look in how they can improve their performance, be it selling more, be it getting better customer satisfaction. And our role as a trainer is then, okay, how can we make that transition smoothly? So giving them optimal training and making sure that when users go live, so to speak, at the end of a project and really understand how the system works, they get quick benefits and they can see a quick return of investment on how they're doing. And that's in the end about a lot. So having done that knowledge, so you have your sales knowledge, your cloud knowledge, you have your industry knowledge. What are then some of the skill sets that you need? I think one of the key ones is actually PowerPoint creation. It's not just about putting some comments on a slide, but also make it interesting for an end user. Nobody wants to go deaf by PowerPoint. So having hundreds of slides for a training session, that doesn't really work. So you have to try to make sure that you make them, the ones that you present, are interesting to look at. And also how you can then do smooth transactions going over into org demos and org exercises. Often you find that PowerPoint presentations that are used for training are gigantic. And that is because there are often a lot of screenshots in there about how to do things. They are there, I think, for the trainer as sort of a handheld that if you get stuck, you can always go back there. Or emergency situations. I have been once that I had to do training and we were in a basement and I couldn't get into the client Wi-Fi network. So I had to rely on my 4G, but the basement didn't have 4G access. So I had to rely on screenshots in my PowerPoint to do the presentation. Far from ideal, but you have to have that as a backup. And so although I didn't mention it here as a skill set, being incredibly flexible and thinking about solutions there and then, you definitely need that. In addition, I would say you need to have a strong voice. And what I mean by that is, you have to talk the whole day and often the whole day. And you need to explain to people how things work. And if you're in a classroom, the whole classroom needs to hear you. Not just the two people in front of you, but, sometimes you have big areas. And so the back of the room has also to be able to hear you. And you don't want to come across shouting. So where you really can improve yourself if you want to as a trainer is how do you project your voice from the front of the class to the back of the class, whereby you still make sure, you sound interesting, you use your intonation, but you don't shout. One of the funny things in that area is I did a couple of years ago a training and that I had some people that were late often. And so I was able to, in a funny way and in a polite way, tell them off because, hey, they're still customers. And so after a while, I had the tendency of standing at the door when we were about to start. And I just had to say something like hello. And my voice was loud enough that the people in the restaurant felt like, training is about to start, let's run. And it gave some quite funny areas and comments to laugh about. And it also lightened up the atmosphere a bit. But having that projection of your voice will really help you. And also save your voice. You can't shout because you just won't last a whole day or several long days of training. With your strong voice, you only do that when you have confidence. And the confidence comes by of your experience, how long you've been doing it. It's about how well you know the materials. Have you built them yourself? Have somebody giving them to you? And also about your background. So knowing your stuff, builds confidence. And it sounds very obvious, but actually being able to portray that is really key. You don't, and everybody knows that when you go to a training session and you have a trainer who sort of whispers, sort of mumbles through stuff, skips stuff, so quickly goes through areas, you to think like, yeah, there's something going on here and you won't pick it up. So you have to make sure you're confident in what you're doing. You know your materials, you know how to troubleshoot. If something goes wrong, it shouldn't throw you off. Like the example like that of, you have no connection. You have to make sure you have a backup there, which makes sure that your training runs smoothly. And so you know that if something happens, I have all these things that I can pull out of my head and out of my laptop to make sure training continues. I think one of the biggest things you need to have is patience. Often you need to explain to people things several times, not just once, but sometimes 5, 6, 7 times. And sometimes there are simple things like click on the edit button to edit a record and then click on save. And then actually, where do you find the edit button on your screen? So navigate to the right-hand side or double click on the pencil, things like that, which are for us normal as heavy users of the system, and users are not. The other side is also, we really know how systems work. We're all sort of like tech savvy. Anybody who has Salesforce experience, you become quite tech savvy. Most of the end users are not. For example, a while ago when I did training, I had a user who needed to log in, and unfortunately it was a remote training, which made it extra tricky. And we spent half an hour for that person to try to click on the URL to go to the org and then typing in their username and a password. And we literally spent half an hour on a Teams call trying to go through this without me trying to whack my head against the wall thinking like, what is this so complicated? There are users like that out there. And, they have been using computers. They've been using old systems. And for them, it's sometimes just tricky to transition, let alone if you talk with a certain group of people who might not really use computers and all of a sudden have to start computers. You have to be able to say, okay, slow it down, take a step back. Let's go through everything again. So if you are an impatient person, I would say don't become a trainer because you really be tested on a day-to-day basis. Finally, I think one of the skill sets you need is that you actually need to be able to translate sort of whatever Salesforce jargon is at tech speak into day-to-day terms. An example here is, not too long ago, I was applying for a new project and the client asked that all the trainers who were applying for the project, what they had to do is they had to explain what activities are. It sounds so simple, but for a lot of users, they think like they don't understand activities. And so be able to say, this is about events, and events are basically calendar meetings, and your tasks is basically your to-do list. Yeah, and you record some information, like you recorded a phone conversation you made, things like that. Being able to do that, it doesn't sound like rocket science, but for customers, when you come in for training, if you throw all this text speak out, like, oh, I'm starting about record pages and page layouts and an app here and a tab there, they don't get it. So you really have to go for most of them slowly. Yes, there's a lot of them who do get it, but you will have a very mixed audience. So taking your time, trying to explain these things, that will really help. And that is where also you would rely on your knowledge. The more knowledge you have about the system, the more you've looked into how the different clouds work, what the capabilities are, the more you can explain this to an end user. Now, having talked about the skill sets and about some of your knowledge, now let's look about what a training project look like. And this is to me what the training project in an absolute ideal world would look like. They're not all look like this. Some do only pieces of this. But if you want to, as a business, have a really smooth running training project and make sure your end users are taken care of, I would definitely say you need these elements. I, as a trainer, sometimes go through the whole process. Sometimes I'm thrown in only partway through. It really depends on the type of project that are coming my way. In ideal world, we start actually when a project starts. So with that, I mean they're either doing a big implementation or they have a lot of sprints that they're doing with big changes. And so you should come in from the beginning. And at that beginning, what you want to do is scope out the training needs. It's not something that a training can just be done in a couple of days. Building proper training materials, and I'll come to that in a second, and preparing for your training and doing all that stuff, that just takes time. And it takes often far more time than people realize. So ideally, the moment you start talking with the development team, saying an implementation for, Service Cloud, you start and you say to the development team, your architects comes in, they do the scoping out of everything. Once you sort of have that top line plan together, you need somebody in there that is a trainer. Even if they just come in the beginning for a couple of days and they do the scoping of the plan, it doesn't mean you need them full time, but you need somebody from that background from the beginning to help you guide you when you need training. And ideally, as a consultant or an educational person or as a trainer, you scope out the plan throughout the project. So where do we need training? It's not just end user training. If you do proper UAT testing and you want to use your end users, you will need training for that. You can't just say to end users, tomorrow we're going to do end-to-end testing. Can you come in and test it? They haven't seen the system before. So you have to have provided training before you can actually let them loose on the system and do the testing. So you need to get days or weeks before you do your testing to spend on doing end user training. Part of the early training and the early planning is also gather your requirements. And in there are some big items. And again, businesses are in different levels on these. Some are very good and some need a bit more guidance. One of the things is business processes. And so what that, not just what should Salesforce do, like should we fire off, process builder, should we do workflows, do we need approval processes with business process? Okay, what does an end user do? So how do they, say if there's a sales team, how do they create an opportunity? At which moment do they create it? How do they go through the different phases? And do they need to do certain things for phases? If they log a call, when do they do that? And are there certain information that needs to go in there? And so these business processes, with it sort of a day in the life of a user, all needs to be scoped out. For those, you need your internal experts, because we as external trainers, you don't have the know-how. But that takes, again, quite some time. It's not something that you scope out in maybe 1 or 2 days. It sometimes is something that goes over for weeks, especially because often when you introduce Salesforce, you also introduce change. And so a lot of businesses use that opportunity to start instilling new behavior and upskilling the people. So having a good foundation of the business processes, you use that to build your training. At the same time, you need to look a bit like at the obvious about what kind of delivery do we? Is it classroom, or like now, thanks to last year's COVID, do we need to do more face-to-face? If you do that, how many people are there in my sessions? What kind of timeline do we have? When do we start training and when do we go live? With that goes the amount of users you have. Do you talk about hundreds or do you talk about thousands of users? If you have a lot of users, do we need multiple trainers? And if so, when do they all come in? And can they all come for the whole period? And one of the big things that's often forgotten is data requirements. So from an early time, you need to think about, okay, what is the data I need to do training? Do we need live data being pulled in? In an ideal world, when an end user does training, it really helps them if they see real accounts and real contacts and some realistic opportunities. Yes, we can make everything up. And I think most of us who do anything in testing have probably extended their skills in using either Disney characters or famous people to set up anything. So I think we've come across enough Bugs Bunnies as test accounts that everybody recognizes them. But, for an end user, they would like to see a real person there and a real account name. And so how much data do you need? If you train thousands of users, how many records do I need for them to do training? Also, what system do you use? Am I going to use the UAT system? Do I get a training org? In an ideal world, you have your own training org. But often you piggyback on another platform, and it's most likely, the UAT sandbox. And that brings implication with it on things like, sprint releases, bug fixes. There's constant change going on. So all of that needs to be done in the pre-scoping. That's when you put out your plan. That's when you say, this is what we're going to do. And then the training team should come in, if it's one person or a whole team. And they then need to understand the plan. They will need to then talk with somebody from development who can show you the system in and out. And they can then also see what are the requirements, how many days do we need, how many sessions. And that is when they can start building the training. In my ideal world, for training, you use a modular system. So, for example, you have an intro module that talks a bit about what is Salesforce and how do you navigate, and then everything else you build modular. So maybe one on accounts, maybe one on opportunities, and then maybe one on tasks, and then different one on chatter. Because the ideal is if you use a modular system, you develop them once, and then you can piggyback to different user groups. Because often you don't just have one type of user. You have like managers and sales users and directors and assistants. And some people need one area and some people don't need that, but they need something else. And so you build up a lot of these modules. Now, to give you a little bit about timings, roughly, and that depends a bit per project, but if you need like 8 hours of training, so a full day of training, to do a proper development of that, which the materials, which is normally your PowerPoint, which may be some Q&A pages, making sure your data plan is there, having tested everything, probably takes a trainer about 15 days to build that. So if your requirement is that we need 3 days of training, doesn't mean that that is 45 days. You can make some gains in there, but it probably takes you the better part of 1 to 2 months to build that. And so when you're planning to go live, don't just wait for the last minute to come in. That's also why sometimes training projects, they can take quite a bit of time before you actually do the stuff. Because once you start delivering, that can go relatively quickly in compared to the development. With delivery, again, in a project, you try to sort of plan it out a little bit that you don't necessarily have everything back to back. But again, that's what we do as a trainer. So if we need to do one day after the next, that's fine. But again, we need to think about, do we need night sessions? Do we need weekend sessions? Do we have shift patterns? Do we need face-to-face? Do we do across the world? So all that takes into account. But the trainer, after they create the materials, they do the delivery. In an ideal project, you also think a little bit about aftercare. So do we, as trainers, go live support? Do we do floor walking? One of the big things we definitely need to do is handover. Once all the training is done, after that, it should be BAU. And so we should either train somebody in the HR team or the Salesforce admin to say, these are the materials, this is how the training runs. Yeah, so not just saying, oh, we've done our last day of training and we're off. There should be some aftercare program in there. So therefore, training projects, they can last from everything and anything. So I have projects that have been maybe just about 30 days. So a bit of development and then a bit of delivery. to projects that have lasted, 19 months, 20 months, because they're so big and there's so much going on. This is, like I said, the ideal scope. What I often found as a trainee, you come in and out. So you might be needed a bit around the beginning, and then they say, okay, we need you again in 3 months' time to do the next bit. And, so that's why I say with a lot of projects, if you build a good relationship with your customer, you keep on coming back. And so often you run multiple projects, multiple clients at the same time. Now, to finish then off, let's then look what I actually then do on a day-to-day training. So what during a project. So, well, first of all, I spend a lot of time in PowerPoint. More than I want, but I do spend the majority and the bulk of my time just plowing to PowerPoint, optimizing training. That is not just to build the materials for training, and that's also making them ready for handovers, making them ready for other users, so making sure that there are good speaker notes in there. And on the back of it, also making sure you create an end user guide. So often businesses want to have a document for end users to refer back to. So you create maybe a second presentation where you take a lot of stuff out, but you make them really good for end users. So in there, you do your screenshots. In there, you do your explanations in a bit more detail and better language than you might do in your training deck. I also spend a lot of time scoping out business processes. So I'm talking with a lot of subject matter experts, product owners, internal specialists, trying to understand what the end user does and trying to incorporate that in the training. Because an ideal training, it's all about what does an end user do? So a day in their life. They come in at 9 o'clock, what do they start? And how can we bring Salesforce throughout that day through all the stuff they do? And so having those business processes, talking with those people are fundamental. Ideally, they're there before you come in as a trainer. If the scoping out at the beginning has been done well, sometimes you get involved in writing those and having some very good discussions with internal experts, and guide them into, okay, what can the system do? Where do we do change? And how can we get this to work? I work a lot with dev teams, so to understand impacts of sprints and bugs, especially, like I said, we often have a shared org. Unfortunately, we don't have always the luxury of having our own training org, but things change. We're all working agile this day and age, so constant change is happening. And so we need to be on the top of our game as trainer to see, okay, if a new release comes out, what's the impact on training? What's the impact on the org? Do we need to update our materials? Do we need to make maybe small refresher packs? Or is it just a simple email that will help them? At the same time, in training, you find bugs. You find problems because all of a sudden a lot of people go into an org. And so how do you work with your development team to get those fixed? Some are urgent because they might stop training. Some might be a bit long term. And so I normally develop, as good as I can, a good relationship with the developer team because you need each other. They get feedback from me, but I need their feedback. And so working with them is pretty much a day-to-day thing. Of course, I spend a lot of time delivering, so either face-to-face or remote, or do things like that, is recording sessions. And so recording training sessions is also not uncommon. And unfortunately, the thing that I don't really like is rearranging sessions or dealing with non-attendance. At the client, emergency things happen, and sometimes it's really busy, and so training gets put on the back burner. But often in a training plan, you're really busy and having a tight program, and so trying to figure out when can I slot these people in which session can they join, can I do it in the timeline I have. Is often the less enjoyable bits of the training, but that just happens, Unfortunately for myself, I don't fall sick often, so I haven't had the challenge yet that I had to rearrange because I wasn't there. But, things happen, and so that needs to be built in the plan. But, it's one of those admin things that, you can't get your head around. You just have to do them. So I hope with this session, I've given you quite some idea about what we do as a trainer and where we come into play and what skill sets you need. Feel free to ping me on my Twitter and drop me a line if you're interested in becoming a trainer or are interested in hiring me as a trainer. Always good too. And I especially also want to thank now our sponsors. Without them, this day wouldn't be possible. And I hope you see a lot of other fantastic sessions. And yeah, let me know on my Twitter feed what you thought about this, and hopefully speak to you all soon again. Thank you.